Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming, and we're really excited to have Dr. Haneen Ghabra with us today to speak about Muslim women and white femininity. She is an assistant professor at Kuwait University's Department of Mass Communication, and she's the author of the book Muslim Women and White Femininity, Reenactment and Resistance, which just came out this year. She's won top paper awards a number of times, including the Outstanding Article of the Year Award at the National Communication Association's Feminist Division. And her specialization includes rhetoric and cultural studies with a focus on Muslim women and intersectionality. She also explores hegemonic narratives, especially of whiteness, via text, images, and bodies, and how they're embodied by women of color and third world women. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Haneen Ghabra.
So, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Rochelle and Dana for organizing this and putting up with all my emails. So thank you for bringing me here and for all the logistics. I know it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, so I really wanted to start with that. And so I came to this project for a number of reasons. First, for years, my body was the Muslim carrier of white femininity. And I'm going to define all these terms in a bit. And so I adopted and enacted and performed this white femininity, or also white feminism, on a daily basis, right? And so when I was exposed to this, to a critical rhetorical cultural program during my PhD, I became very interested in the embodiment of different privileges and different feminisms. And I'm going to go through all those terms. I made the talk kind of half theoretical, half rhetorical, okay? And so what I did in the book is I actually combined an autoethnography and a rhetorical criticism. So when I'm talking about rhetorical criticism, I'm talking about analyzing texts, images, bodies. I'm talking about analyzing anything. When I'm talking about autoethnography, I'm talking about studying the self in relation to power structures. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm gonna focus on the rhetorical aspect. But the autoethnography is weaved in throughout my book. So there will be personal narrative in it, in relation to power structures, there will be poetry in it. And so that's what I mean by autoethnography. Now, I'm referring, and so what I'm doing is I'm basically looking at how whiteness travels globally through Muslim bodies who speak the language of the imperialist and not the vernacular. And so some of the questions, for the purpose of time, I didn't put everything in here, right? So some of the questions that I'm looking at are how are Muslim women internalizing and reproducing these whiteness, right? And how are they reproducing whiteness in moments of speaking for their own communities, right? Because they're not speaking with. I'm looking at women that are speaking for. And I'll explain that in a bit. And in what ways has their embodied discourse demonstrated an internalized desire for whiteness by moving towards white femininity and feminism and away from their own identities. Now, when I'm referring to these women as Muslim, I'm not talking about a religious phenomenon. I'm talking about a cultural. I'm referring to Muslim in a cultural sense. Okay, so just keep that in mind also while we're going through this lecture. Now, when I'm defining white Western feminism, I'm defining it as a universalized feminism. That is not wrong for white women. It applies to white women, right? But I'm talking about white feminism that has emerged out of whiteness and is the prevailing feminism that we hear of in the textbooks, in apparatuses such as the media, popular culture, education, and so forth. So when I'm referring to that, that's what I'm referring to, a universalized feminism, okay? So I'm talking about the first movement and the second wave movement of feminism that happened in the US. And so when I'm talking about intersectional feminism, have you all heard of intersectional feminism? So I'm basically an intersectional feminist. So when I'm talking about intersectional feminism, I'm talking about that I'm referring to feminism that was birthed out of the grounds of women of color. I'm talking about the third movement that happened in the US maybe in the 90s. And I'm talking about the experiences of women are the product of the intersections of race, of class, of sexism. So a white woman, a white uneducated woman is going to have a different experience than a black woman who's uneducated, right? In Kuwait, a woman who doesn't have a nationality, which we call Badoon in Kuwait, is going to have a completely different experience than a Kuwaiti woman who is, let's say, a professor, right? So these intersections define equality for a woman of color. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about intersectional feminism. Now, whiteness, when I'm talking about ideologies of whiteness, because there's a whole field of literature, and I'm happy to give you names later on, but there's a whole field of literature that speaks about whiteness as an ideology. So when I'm speaking about whiteness, I'm speaking about the system of power, right? So that privileges performances of civility through this white Anglo-Saxon learning. This includes racial superiority, such as favoring philosophies and performances of both white people and non-white people, right? Those who re-perform it and re-secure it adequately. Now, so I'm talking about a system that is providing these acceptable performances. So when I'm using whiteness for the project, I'm using it as this force that moves with and beyond these structural systems. So I'm not saying, oh, white people are racist. No, I'm saying that there's an ideology that affects all bodies, whether they're white, whether they're people of color, whether they're people from marginalized identities, etc., right? So, and then when I'm talking about standard performances, I'm talking about the embodiment of other privileges also, which I'm going to go into in a little bit. Education, white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, you could even say thin-bodied, you could say attractive bodies. I'm talking about all these privileges, right? And so, just to give you a little example of how, because in order to understand how Muslim women are people of color at large, or any identity that's being oppressed by a certain identity embodies a certain identity, we have to understand what happened with feminism in the Middle East. And so, I'm not a historian, but I'm going to tell you how this bifurcation happened between feminism. And so, if we go back and we look at, after World War II, and we look at when, the Soviet and the US, and we had these two superpowers, and the US wasn't really, happy about the Soviet being there. And what happened is the US allied with Islamists in Afghanistan. So when they allied with Islamists in Afghanistan, they were training them, there were these programs that were developing, and so Orientalism and modernization were central to these programs. Now when I'm talking about Orientalism, talking about, Edward Said, who talks about Orientalism as this exercise of cultural strength, but a discourse that is produced in uneven exchange, right? So I'm talking about cultural stereotypes. I'm talking about the colonist studying the Orient, or studying the other. So that's what I mean by why these, and so what I'm trying to say is Orientalism and modernization were central to these programs that they were developing, right? So we're training the Islamists in Afghanistan, or the US is training the Islamists in Afghanistan. So there was a connection there. Now, it's important to note that under the Reagan administration, they were interested in freeing the region from communism, and they were interested in getting the Soviet also to weaken the Soviet. And so what happened is there become more training. You have training by Osama bin Laden. Now Deepa Kumar actually talks about this. She wrote a book called Islamophobia, so she talks about this in depth. I highly recommend you read that book. But basically, as a result, 33 branches were opened across the US. So we have these very same Afghan veterans who were being trained would later on use these skills against the US for a number of reasons. First, the Islamists, and when I'm talking they were going to use these skills, I'm talking 90s and onwards. So first we had the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now that conflict was way before that, okay? We have 1948, and then we have the other war in the 60s. Now the Israeli-Palestinian conflict created a lot of resentment towards the West, okay? In the 80s, Israeli right-wingers, see now my jet lag's kicking in. So if I speak Arabic, just wait, be like, hey, you're not in Kuwait, okay? So Israeli right-wingers and neoconservatives began this project of Islamic terrorism. It wasn't that it wasn't there. It was there, but it became more aggressive after the 80s. So again, it's creating resentment, right? Second, we have colonialism. How did colonialism shape feminism? Colonialism was directly linked to the shaping of feminism in the Arab world. And Leila Ahmed talks about this in depth in her book Quiet Revolution, where she says there was this internalization of the colonial narrative, right? And so she talks about basically, so she says, the British were colonizing Egypt and then they wanted to leave. So if you're colonizing Egypt and you want to leave, who are you going to hand over the country to logically? The upper class or the lower class? The upper class, right? And so by handing them over, one of the prerequisites was, and it wasn't like it was written down or anything, was basically, you know, you might need to unveil, you might need to be a little bit more modern, and that's what happened. So you have all these upper class women and upper middle class and maybe middle class unveiling, modernizing, and then you have the lower class which hung on to the hijab and to the veil. Now, I don't want to think of hijab as in two interpretations. There's at least 15 or 20 interpretations, which Layla Ahmed talks about in Quiet Revolution, in her book Quiet Revolution. But what happened is there became the split, first of all, right? Then we have people like Qasim Amin, who was considered one of the first feminists in the region, but in fact he was internalizing the colonial narrative. So he was talking about feminism and the women need to take off their veils, and the women are all oppressed. And so again, we see this narrative that all Muslim women are oppressed, which is problematic. And so those who consider themselves feminists had to vocalize the colonial narrative. And if you didn't vocalize the colonial narrative, you were anti-feminist. So I think this is really important to understand the bifurcation that happened between feminism, right? You had anti-occupation, anti-imperialism, then you had modernization and westernization. So have you heard of the Femin movement? Has anyone in here heard of the Femin movement? Okay, good. So the Femin movement was basically a movement that started in Eastern Europe by a bunch of white women that for a Moroccan woman, Amina Tyler, who posted her naked body on Twitter and said, "This is, my body belongs to me," right? And so this whole, all these protests erupted all over the Middle East and in Europe. And you see this, this is an example of this modernization and westernization where they're speaking for her. And so then there was another campaign where a bunch of Muslim women said, "Nudity does not liberate me, I don't need saving, hashtag Muslim pride, hashtag feminism." So this is just an example of what I'm trying to tell you, is there is a divide and there's a split, okay? And in this split, white feminism, first of all, has followed closely behind these Orientalist discourses. When we're talking about Muslim women, because again, I've told you, white feminism applies for white women, but it doesn't apply for Muslim women of color. It's not that it's a wrong thing, okay? But also, how does feminism present Muslim women? And so, if Muslim women is in relation to Western feminism, right, and there's this whole field, like, I don't know if there are any philosophy students here, but if you look at the field of ethics, the whole field is always about being in relation to the other. Ethics is being in relation to the other. And I talk about that in the beginning of my book, and then I go back at the end. Because if a Muslim woman is always in relation to Western feminism, then these narratives will constantly be in relation to, and therefore in a position of inferiority, right? And so we see this relational dialectic, which is prevalent in the literature, as I'm telling you, and which will always place those in a marginalized identity in this zero-sum relationship. And so one of the most fundamental underpinnings of not only my work and not only of this book is that while I'm sitting here and talking to you about whether it is white racism or the internalization of white racism, it's very important to know that we do have oppression in the Middle East. But oppression manifests differently in country to country, in region to region. I'm not saying that we don't have oppression, but we have our own set of problems, but it manifests differently. And this is very important to know, okay? So if I'm lecturing in Kuwait, I'm not going to be lecturing about white racism. I'm going to be lecturing about Kuwaiti racism. I'm going to be lecturing about the domestic workers. I'm going to be lecturing about class privilege. So also the audience and the context, okay? And so if we bring this dialectic, this relational dialectic that I'm talking about, down to the tactical level, then we may see that the words Muslim and woman combined into one word, Muslim woman, has evoked this singular identity, right? Where race and gender become conflated. So Muslim woman has become more visible post 9/11, right? So obviously we have 9/11 and there were anxieties around what was right and wrong for Muslim women. The Muslim woman signifies race, citizenship, gender, and the veil, the hijab, it functions as this racial indicator. It's like a racial, gender, religious indicator attached to the body of the Muslim woman, right? And so it's served as that. And so this Muslim woman is always deprived of any agency. For example, the politics of covering, right? In one way, it is one way in which women are deprived of agency. Now, it's important to note that the politics of covering is different in the East and different in the West. So woman, what's so tragic about the Muslim woman is she's been stuck between two patriarchies. So she's stuck in the East because Saudi Arabia and other countries are saying you have to wear the veil by law. And this is not all the region, right? Maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Iran, maybe Afghanistan, right? But then in the East, or the West, or if you go, let's say, to France, or it used to be in Turkey, they want you to take off the veil. So the Muslim woman has always been deprived of agency because you have these two patriarchies speaking for her about whether she should wear the veil or not. Why doesn't she decide if she wants to wear it, right? And so you have this whole dynamic happening. And so it's important to note that the hijab becomes a marker for the Muslim woman who can be easily marginalized by more secular Muslim women, or Muslim women that don't wear the hijab, people that look like me, right? It's very easily, because the hijab is a marker, and it's a dangerous marker, especially after September 11th. And so, for example, if we talk about privilege and oppression, I have the privilege of getting away with not wearing the hijab, right? But I might have other things that mark me, like my accent or the way I look. And so, that's what I mean also when I talk about intersectionality. So when I want to think about this methodologically, and so rhetorical criticism is this. So we basically it's a combination of methods and theory together. That's the way we actually write. And so I'm looking at the. I'm a post-colonial scholar. I'm a post-colonial intersectional feminist. And so when I'm talking about post-colonial studies, I'm talking about discursive imperialism. That's what I mean by rhetoric. I'm talking about how we need to understand that rhetorical post-colonial studies needs to rethink ways about textuality, authority, and social agency. I'm also talking about hybridity. I'm talking about diasporic identities. When I talk about hybridity, it must be understood as a communicative process. So in other words, I'm looking at how are women of color performing and internalize the hybridity of whiteness and heteronormativity and otherness all at the same time. And so the third thing, and I really think this is more important than anything else, and I write a lot about this, is reflexivity. Academics need to be reflexive, not just academics, but even the general public, about who has the authority to represent the view of the other. So if I am from another privilege and I'm speaking for another community, am I speaking for or speaking with? There's certainly nothing wrong with doing that, but are you speaking with, right? And so again, speaking for or speaking with, which comes from a lot of Linda Alcoff's work. If you look up her article, I can't remember the name of the article right now, but she speaks, I think it's called Speaking For actually, but she speaks about the politics of speaking for or speaking with. And it's a very, very, very powerful article to read. So what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm doing an archetypal criticism. So it's a critical method where I'm critiquing standards that are performed by the marginalized in the name of dominant performances. And so this criticism can be situated as a critical method to study different performances, texts, embodiments. It can allow us to interrogate global spectacles that dominate the media, popular culture, education, and so on. And so it allows us a closer reading of performances. So it doesn't mean that when we're engaging in criticism, everything is hegemonic or powerful or dominant. Sometimes we can use the master's tools, so we can use those privileged positionalities to actually trespass into cultural spaces that aren't ours and make a point. So if I wasn't able to speak English and I wasn't able to look the way I wouldn't be able to actually speak to you, right? If I didn't know how to speak, there would be a little bit of a problem here. So I'm able to culturally trespass, right? Go to my national communication conference, go to my other conferences, and talk about issues that are important. So this cultural trespassing narrative goes hand in hand with archetypal criticism. And so how do these archetypes circulate? They circulate in a number of ways. So I wanted to show it to you theoretically first. And I think that, so this is from Patricia Hill Collins, and she talks, she's probably my favorite writer. So she talks about Black feminist thought, and she talks about these 4 areas of power. Now what I did is I put it into charts usually for my students, just because I feel like it's so much easier to look at things visually than to actually just read about it. And so if we look at the first domain, the hegemonic domain, we're talking about hegemony, right? So we're talking about power, we're talking about ideologies, we're talking about power that circulates. It's not something that's tangible. It's something that's circulating, that's powerful, but you can't really put your finger on it, right? And so if we're talking about hegemony, this is the domain that's going to connect all the other three power domains. So I'm talking about power at a macro level. Now the hegemonic, the structural, is the legal systems, the labor, the media, right? Because I'm a media scholar, it's the most important for me. The government, the housing, those are the structural domains that set up all these different discriminations or archetypes to circulate. The disciplinary then enforces it, right? We see that through the prison system, especially in the US, right? We see it even in the prison system in Israel. We see it in all the prison systems. We see that in police. We see that in academia, especially in academia. So I'm talking about the disciplinary as the one that is going to support the structural, is going to reinstate, is going to implement everything. And then of course the interpersonal level where you have the what we call microaggressions, the day-to-day aggressions. And those are not minimal. Those can be more powerful and more discriminatory than the actual hegemonic or let's say structural structures, right? And so here is, again, this is like my diagram of intersectionality. I usually have more, but if you look here, we have different privileges, right? So we have, so if we bring the power that I showed you, the four domains, these four domains, they translate into every single one of our bodies sitting here. Our bodies carry those power. If you think that if you don't have privilege and you don't have a power, then you're not reflecting, which is why I went back to, and I was talking about being reflexive, right? So if we look at these privileges, we have ability privilege, we have gender privilege, being male. In the US, racial privilege, white. If you went to Kuwait, racial privilege would be Kuwaiti, right? Or pure Kuwaiti. You have class privilege, which is, let's say, upper middle class. You have education privilege. Having a PhD is a privilege. You have a heterosexual privilege. I could go on, right? And so here, there's always going to be a marginalized identity that's directly in opposition. So if you have ability privilege and you have special needs, you have gender privilege, female, etc., etc. Now this is where I'm looking at, right? I have people of color and I have white privilege. Okay, you're all with me? Okay, good. So here is, now what happens sometimes is it's painful to be oppressed, right? When you have any sort of different positionality or point of oppression, it's painful. And so what happens is there becomes this embodiment of, let me embody my oppression. So we see that a lot with females embodying patriarchy, right? So when sometimes you're like, oh man, she's embodying patriarchy. So, or she's embodying male privilege. We do that a lot, and it translates into all these intersections. So there's also the embodiment of people of color where they will embody whiteness, right? Because that's easier. It's easier to get into the global limelight. It's easier to not think about the oppression that's happening, and so on. And so what I'm trying to say is we carry all these things in our bodies. So we could embody these things at times, and I've done it. I've done it sometimes where I actually do it, and then I'm like, oh my God, did I just do that? And so that's what I mean by reflexivity again. Now, what I did in the book is I broke it down into 3 archetypes. Now, there are not only 3. There is so many. I talk about the other ones, like, the Muslim, the exotic belly dancer, and all these other different archetypes. But for the book, I narrowed it down into the oppressed, the advocate, and the humanitarian. And I looked at different types of rhetoric for each archetype. And so it's important to note that these archetypes are sometimes, as I told you, disidentifying. So when I say disidentifying, I'm talking about Munoz, who's a queer scholar, who talks about disidentification as you're not necessarily always against power, but you can also be with it. And that's still a way of resisting, right? So again, it goes back to that notion where I was talking about cultural trespassing. So sometimes it's okay to go with it. Thank you.